In the scorching heart of ancient Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates carved life into the land, the Assyrian Empire rose to power through conquest, innovation, and terror. Their cities gleamed with gold and iron, but behind the grandeur lurked a shadow of unimaginable cruelty. Among their arsenal of punishments stood one of the most feared of all, flaying, the stripping of human skin while the victim still breathed. The Assyrians were not merely warriors, they were masters of psychological warfare. Their kings, like Ashurnasirpal II and Tiglath-Pileser III, ruled with iron fists and a chilling sense of spectacle. Each campaign against rebellious provinces was followed by scenes meant to crush not only bodies, but spirits. Walls of captured cities were lined with impaled enemies, heads were piled in pyramids, and for the defiant, flaying awaited. The ritual of flaying was more than punishment, it was performance. When an Assyrian army stormed a city, scribes followed closely behind soldiers. They recorded every act of horror, engraving the details on stone reliefs for the gods and future generations to witness. The message was clear: defy Assyria, and your skin would decorate its walls. At the great city of Kalhu, modern Nimrud, King Ashurnasirpal II built his magnificent palace. On its limestone walls he ordered scenes of his victories carved in painstaking detail. Among the triumphs and banquets, there were panels showing prisoners tied to posts, soldiers methodically peeling skin from their flesh. It was propaganda by pain, meant to echo through time. The act itself was ritualized. The condemned was stripped naked and bound upright, often against a city wall or temple gate. The executioners, trained for precision, would begin at the limbs, slicing with bronze or obsidian knives. Every cut was deliberate, slow enough to preserve the victim's consciousness. The air would fill with screams that mingled with chants from the watching soldiers. The skin, once removed, was not discarded. It was nailed to the gates of conquered cities or draped on walls as a warning to all who entered. Inscriptions from Assyrian tablets proudly recount these deeds. One such record from the reign of Ashurnasirpal II boasts, "I flayed many right through my land and spread their skins upon the walls." To the Assyrians it was divine justice, violence sanctified by gods like Ashur and Ishtar. Why such brutality? Fear was their greatest weapon. The Assyrian Empire spanned vast territories, from the mountains of Anatolia to the deserts of Syria, and rebellion simmered constantly. To maintain control, they turned terror into policy. The skin of a rebel governor on the city gate was more persuasive than any treaty. Travelers from subjugated lands brought back tales of horror. Merchants whispered that Assyrian soldiers carried knives blessed for skinning traitors. Others swore the executioners wore masks to protect their souls from vengeance spirits. Whether true or not, these stories served the empire well, spreading dread faster than their armies marched. Within the capital, the king's scribes inscribed each punishment on clay tablets and palace walls. These carvings were not mere decoration, they were history written in suffering. They depicted the king standing tall, divine in stature, while his captives shrieked beneath the knife. Every stroke of the chisel told future generations what disobedience meant under Assyrian rule. For those witnessing the act, the flaying was both terror and theater. Crowds gathered, soldiers held order, priests recited blessings. The condemned might be an enemy commander, a rebellious governor, or even a captured spy. No one was spared based on status. The higher the rank, the greater the spectacle. In some accounts, the skinning was accompanied by fire. Torches were lit to cauterize the bleeding flesh, prolonging life just long enough for the audience to see the agony. When death finally came, it was not release, but conclusion. The victim's remains left hanging as food for the sun and flies. Behind this cruelty lay belief. The Assyrians saw pain as purification, the flayed body as an offering to their gods. The ritual ensured cosmic balance, order through destruction. To them, the screams of their enemies were hymns of divine justice. This theology made their empire nearly unstoppable for centuries. Among the captives who awaited punishment, silence was rare. Some cursed the gods of Assyria, others begged for mercy. But the flayers had no ears for mercy. They were instruments of the king's will, trained to obey, to slice, to preserve control through fear. Their work was meticulous, clean cuts, steady hands, unbroken resolve. By the time the last strip of skin was removed, the onlookers had already absorbed the message. No rebellion could end well. The walls of Nineveh and Calhu glistened with the proof. Wind carried the stench of death, and yet, to the Assyrian people, it was the scent of peace. Peace through dominance. Over time, flaying became an emblem of royal authority. Kings mentioned it in their inscriptions as casually as they spoke of building temples or hunting lions. To them, it was a civic duty, proof that they maintained order in a chaotic world. Each act of flaying reaffirmed the divine bond between ruler and gods. Foreign envoys, upon visiting the empire, were escorted past these walls of warning. They returned home trembling, carrying tales of the Assyrian skinners. Even without armies, those stories conquered cities. The fear of Assyrian reprisal kept entire nations obedient. And yet, not all within the empire approved. Some priests whispered that the gods grew weary of so much blood. Some citizens turned their eyes away when the screams began. But to question the king's justice was to invite the same fate. Thus, silence became survival. In time, as the empire expanded, the ritual of flaying followed its armies like a shadow. From the mountains of Urartu to the plains of Babylon, no corner of the known world was safe from its terror. Stone carvings, now displayed in modern museums, still bear the faint outlines of those suffering figures, testaments to how far fear can travel through centuries. When the sun set over the Assyrian capital, the execution grounds would quiet. Blood dried on the walls, and the wind whispered through strips of hanging skin. To the victors, it was a symbol of power. To the conquered, it was a reminder that pain itself had become language, the tongue of empires. And deep within the palace, beneath the eyes of stone-carved gods, the king would dine in victory, surrounded by music, wine, and servants. Yet outside his halls, beneath torches flickering in the night, the empire's true foundation glistened, built not from gold or stone, but from the peeled flesh of the defeated. The Assyrians had mastered the art of fear, but fear, like the human body, decays. For every scream that echoed through their cities, a curse was whispered against them. The empire believed its cruelty would endure forever. But even as they celebrated their dominion, cracks began to form, tiny fissures beneath the blood-soaked walls of their pride. The Assyrians believed that fear was as essential as faith. To them, terror was not random cruelty, but a carefully designed instrument of power. Their kings, Ashurnasirpal II, Sennacherib, and Esarhaddon, understood that a terrified populace was a loyal one. Every scream, every public punishment, every strip of flesh torn from a living man was a line in their unwritten code of governance. When the empire marched to war, it did not merely seek victory, it sought memory. Assyrian soldiers were as much storytellers as they were executioners. They knew that news of their brutality would gallop faster than their chariots. By the time they reached the next city, its gates often swung open willingly, desperate to avoid the fate of those who resisted. In the royal annals carved into stone, flaying was mentioned alongside triumphs and divine blessings. One inscription from King Ashurbanipal reads, "I flayed their chiefs and draped their skins upon the city walls to show the power of my god Ashur." These were not secret horrors, but celebrated acts, proudly displayed to legitimize divine favor. To an outsider, it was madness, but to the Assyrians, it was order. They saw the world as a constant struggle between chaos and divine rule. Every rebel, every traitor represented disorder, and through punishment, through the ritual of flaying, they restored balance. The gods, they believed, demanded such blood. In the center of Nineveh, the empire's crown jewel, executions were staged as public events. The crowd gathered in the central square, the air thick with incense and dust. Soldiers surrounded a wooden post, while priests recited invocations to Ashur, seeking divine witness to what was about to unfold. The condemned was dragged forward, bound, trembling, stripped of dignity and hope. A royal herald would step forth, his voice booming through the crowd. He recited the prisoner's crimes: rebellion, treason, defiance of the king's will. Then he pronounced the sentence, flaying alive by royal decree. The people, conditioned by years of fear, watched in silence. Some turned their faces away, others watched intently, as if participation in terror ensured their own safety. The flayers approached with their knives glinting in the sun. Their faces were expressionless, trained to detach from mercy. The first cut was always slow, often across the back or the legs. The condemned would thrash and scream until exhaustion took over. Blood streamed onto the dust. Every movement, every gasp was part of a carefully orchestrated display meant to echo across the land. Sometimes the skin was preserved and stretched over wooden frames. These grisly trophies were paraded through the streets or hung at the gates of cities as warnings. Inscriptions beneath them declared the victim's name and crime, a final humiliation, ensuring that even in death, rebellion was punished. Beyond the spectacle, flaying had another function. It cemented loyalty among the king's soldiers. Participation in such rituals hardened them, forging warriors who feared nothing, not even divine wrath. To witness flaying was to see the might of the king manifest in human form. It was proof that the ruler's authority extended even over the boundary between life and death. Assyrian art captured these scenes with haunting precision. In stone reliefs excavated from palaces in Nimrud and Nineveh, one can still see the fine details, the flayers standing in perfect composure, the victims writhing in agony, the king watching calmly from his throne. The artists who carved these images did so not in horror, but in reverence. They were immortalizing justice as their civilization defined it. Yet beneath this grim glory there were whispers. Not everyone believed the gods smiled upon such cruelty. Some priests in hidden corners of the empire began to question whether the divine truly delighted in human suffering. They murmured that Ashur's temples were becoming stained with innocent blood. But dissent, like rebellion, carried the same price: silence or skin. There are ancient tales of soldiers who faltered during a flaying, whose hands shook, whose eyes filled with pity. They did not live long. Mercy was treason in the empire of fear. Even hesitation could mark a man for punishment. For the Assyrian kings, cruelty was not only a message to enemies but a test of loyalty among their own. As the empire grew, so did its appetite for control. The borders stretched far, and maintaining dominance over distant lands required constant reminders of power. The Assyrian army left trails of terror wherever it marched, villages burned, prisoners mutilated, skins nailed to walls. Every act became both punishment and advertisement. One captured city near the Euphrates, Bit Yakin, was said to have been flayed entirely. The rebels who had risen against Assyrian rule were stripped of their skins in public. Their flayed remains were hung from the gates as the new governor, chosen by the Assyrians, took his seat. The message was clear: the gods had chosen their side. Within the royal court, the practice of flaying was also political. Nobles who betrayed the king or plotted in secret were punished publicly to deter others. Court scribes recorded these events as part of the royal chronicles, ensuring that betrayal was met with divine justice. The flaying knife became not only a weapon of war, but an instrument of administration. In the dark chambers beneath the palaces, prisoners awaited their turn. Some were foreign kings captured in battle, others were mere messengers caught in the wrong place. The air in those dungeons was thick with despair. Some begged for death before the ritual began, but the Assyrians rarely granted such mercy. Death was the final act, not the beginning. At night, after the executions, the flayers would wash their hands in basins of perfumed water, as priests whispered purification prayers. They saw themselves as vessels of divine will, cleansing the empire of impurity through pain. The contradiction between faith and horror did not trouble them. To question their purpose was to question the gods themselves. In time, the stories of flaying reached beyond Mesopotamia. Travelers from neighboring lands, Persians, Babylonians, and Greeks, told of the skinners of Assyria, men who wore their enemies' hides as cloaks of power. Though exaggerated, such tales carried the essence of truth. The Assyrians had made fear their national language. And yet deep within the empire, cracks were forming. The more the kings ruled through terror, the more hatred they sowed. Conquered peoples did not forget. They waited, watched, and whispered of revenge. The Assyrians believed themselves eternal, but their walls of flayed skin would one day crumble under the weight of vengeance. For now, however, The empire stood strong, its towers high, its armies vast, and its enemies silent. The gods of Mesopotamia seemed to favor the cruel, and the sun rose each day over cities painted in blood and fear. But the whispers of the oppressed were growing louder, like distant thunder approaching from beyond the mountains. The flaying knife still gleamed, but soon it would turn in the hands of those it once terrified. The same fear that had built an empire would become the seed of its ruin. The gods who once looked upon the walls of Nineveh would one day look away. The Assyrian Empire, once the iron fist of Mesopotamia, began to crumble beneath the very terror that had built it. For centuries, kings had ruled through fear, flaying rebels alive and displaying their skins on city walls as symbols of divine authority. But the same fear that silenced enemies now haunted their own people. Beneath the surface of their magnificent cities, rebellion simmered like fire beneath stone. Whispers spread across the empire. The gods were angry. Crops failed, rivers receded, and omens darkened the skies. Priests who once blessed the flayings began to tremble at the thought of divine wrath. The screams that had once echoed from the walls of Nineveh now echoed in memory, haunting those who had cheered them. The empire's victims, it seemed, were rising in spirit against their conquerors. From the east came the Medes, from the south the Babylonians. United, they marched toward Nineveh. Inside the capital, fear turned inward. Soldiers who had once obeyed without hesitation now questioned their orders. The flayers, the same men who had skinned rebels alive, found their knives useless against an army of vengeance. In 612 BCE, Nineveh fell. The city that had once been the jewel of the world burned for days. Palaces built on suffering turned to ash. As flames consumed the reliefs depicting the flayings, survivors swore they heard the walls scream, as if the agony carved into stone had come alive at last. The conquerors tore down what remained, horrified by the brutality preserved in those carvings. The royal family perished in their own fires, refusing surrender. Their cruelty had finally come full circle, the torturers meeting the same death they had inflicted on others. The Assyrian gods, silent and distant, offered no salvation. The empire that had prided itself on divine favor died abandoned and cursed. Centuries later, archaeologists would uncover the ruins of Nineveh and Nimrud. They found the same carved scenes once used to glorify kings, rows of bound men, executioners peeling their skin with calm precision. What had once been symbols of power now stood as monuments of horror. The inscriptions that boasted, "I flayed my enemies and spread their skins upon the walls," became confessions carved in stone. The Assyrians believed fear would make their legacy eternal, and in a way it did, but not as glory. Instead, they were remembered as the empire that mastered cruelty and was destroyed by it. The same terror that secured their rule ensured their downfall. Today, the wind still blows through the ruins of Nineveh, whispering through cracked stones. Some say that at dusk, faint cries echo across the desert, the ghosts of those who once hung from its walls. Whether myth or memory, it is a fitting end. For in the end, the Assyrians' greatest creation was not their empire but their warning. Fear may build a kingdom, but it can never hold it.